The deafening echo of gunfire haunted Wyatt Griffith's dreams, jerking him awake in the dead of night as sweat trickled down his brow, and his heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for his revolver, a habit formed during 3 hellish years fighting for the Union Army. The war had ended in '65, but 5 years later, in the dusty frontier town of Muskogee in Indian Territory, Wyatt still fought invisible enemies that plagued his mind. Dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the Oklahoma sky in shades of amber and gold. Wyatt rose from his simple cot in the small room he rented above the livery stable. His movements were mechanical as he dressed, strapped on his holster, and pulled his worn brown hat low over his eyes. The small mirror on the wall reflected a man only 30 years of age, but with eyes that had witnessed enough suffering for several lifetimes. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he descended the stairs to the stables. The familiar scent of hay and horses greeted him, bringing a momentary sense of peace. His black stallion, Thunder, nickered softly as Wyatt approached. "Morning, boy," he murmured, running a gentle hand down the horse's muscular neck. Ready for another day. Outside, Muskogee was coming alive. Merchants opened their doors, wagon wheels creaked along the main street, and the distant whistle of the morning train pierced the air. Wyatt had drifted into town 3 months ago, finding work as a ranch hand at the Wilkinson spread outside town. The owner, Henry Wilkinson, was a fair man who didn't ask questions about Wyatt's past, and the hard physical labor helped quiet his mind, at least during daylight hours. Wyatt mounted Thunder and rode toward the ranch, tipping his hat to folks he recognized along the way. He kept his interactions brief, pleasantries exchanged, but nothing that invited deeper conversation. The townsfolk had labeled him the quiet cowboy, and he preferred it that way. The less they knew about him, the better. The Wilkinson Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime grazing land. Cattle dotted the landscape, fat and content under the morning sun. As Wyatt approached the main house, he spotted Henry on the porch, deep in conversation with someone Wyatt didn't recognize, a woman with honey-colored hair pulled back in a simple bun. Henry waved him over. "Griffith. Come meet my niece." Reluctantly, Wyatt dismounted and climbed the porch steps, removing his hat out of respect. The woman turned, and Wyatt found himself looking into the clearest green eyes he'd ever seen. "This is my brother's daughter, Violet Zimmerman," Henry said proudly. "Just arrived from St. Louis yesterday. Violet, this is Wyatt Griffith, best ranch hand I've had in years." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Griffith," she said, extending a delicate hand. "Madam," Wyatt replied, briefly taking her hand before quickly releasing it. Her touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he stepped back, uncomfortable with the sensation. "Violet's going to be staying with us indefinitely," Henry explained. "Her father, my brother James, passed last month. Influenza." "I'm sorry for your loss," Wyatt said automatically, though genuine empathy stirred within him. He knew loss all too well. "Thank you," Violet replied, her voice soft but steady. "I'm looking forward to a fresh start here in Muskogee." Wyatt nodded, already retreating emotionally. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Wilkinson, I should get to work." Of course," Henry said. "We're branding the new calves today. Head on down to the south pasture. The boys are already getting set up." Wyatt nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave. As he mounted Thunder, he felt Violet's eyes on him, curious and observant. He rode away without looking back, but the image of those green eyes stayed with him. The day passed in a blur of dust, sweat, and the plaintive bawling of calves. Wyatt worked tirelessly, finding solace in physical exhaustion. By sunset, his muscles ached, but the work had accomplished its purpose for hours. He hadn't thought about the war, about the men he'd killed, about the friends he'd lost. As the ranch hands made their way back to the bunkhouse, Wyatt noticed a figure sitting on the fence near the corral. Violet Zimmerman watched the sunset, her profile silhouetted against the fiery sky. Something about her stillness, her solitary vigil, resonated with him. Against his better judgment, Wyatt found himself steering Thunder toward her. She turned at his approach, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Griffith," she acknowledged. "Miss Zimmerman," he replied, dismounting. "Enjoying the view." "It's breathtaking," she said, turning back to the horizon. "We don't get sunsets like this in St. Louis." Wyatt leaned against the fence, leaving a respectable distance between them. "No, I reckon not. You've been west for a while?" she asked. "Few years," he answered vaguely. "Moved around a lot. Looking for something? Or running from something?" The directness of her question startled him. Most folks in these parts knew better than to pry. "Just restless, I guess." She studied him for a moment, those green eyes seeming to see right through his carefully constructed walls. "My father was the same way after he came back from the war. Could never settle, always jumping at shadows." Wyatt stiffened. "Your father fought for the Union. 3rd Missouri Infantry." "He never talked about it much." "Smart man," Wyatt muttered. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully. "But I think keeping it all bottled up inside him is what killed him in the end, not the influenza." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. "I should get Thunder stabled for the night, of course." She slid gracefully from the fence. "It was nice talking with you, Mr. Griffith." "Wyatt," he found himself saying. "Just Wyatt is fine." Her smile brightened. "Then I'm Violet, just Violet." He nodded, then led Thunder away, acutely aware of her watching him go. Something about Violet Zimmerman unsettled him, made him feel exposed. And yet, there was also something oddly comforting about her presence, like a warm hearth on a cold winter's night. That night, the nightmares came again. Wyatt thrashed in his small bed, reliving the horror of Antietam, the bloodiest day of his life. In his dream, he was once again crouched in a cornfield, watching men fall like wheat before a scythe. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled his nostrils, and the screams of dying men echoed in his ears. He woke with a strangled cry, reaching for his gun before realizing where he was. Moonlight streamed through the small window of his room, illuminating the sparse furnishings. His heart pounded as if he'd run for miles. Sleep wouldn't return now. It never did after the nightmares. Wyatt pulled on his clothes and slipped outside, seeking solace in the night air. The town was quiet, most windows dark. He walked aimlessly, eventually finding himself at the small church on the edge of town. Its doors were unlocked, as they always were in Muskogee. Inside, a single candle burned near the altar, casting long shadows across the simple wooden pews. Wyatt sat in the back row, hat in hand, not praying he'd lost faith in a benevolent God at Gettysburg, but finding a measure of peace in the stillness. "Couldn't sleep?" a soft voice asked. Wyatt turned, startled. Violet stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, stepping inside. "I often come here at night when sleep eludes me." "You're not intruding," Wyatt said, surprising himself. "It's a public place." She slid into the pew beside him, leaving a respectable distance between them. "In St. Louis, our church was always locked at night. I like that it's open here, like God doesn't keep office hours." Despite himself, Wyatt smiled faintly. "I reckon he doesn't." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the candle's flame dancing in the slight draft. "What was it tonight?" Violet finally asked. "What chased you from your bed?" Wyatt stared straight ahead. "Nothing important. It must have been something." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just old memories. War memories." His silence was answer enough. "My father would sometimes wake up shouting names," she said quietly. "Men from his regiment, I think, men who didn't come home." Wyatt's hands tightened on his hat. "Your father tell you that?" "No, he never discussed it, but I heard him, night after night. It's not something a man wants to burden his family with. Is it a burden shared or a burden doubled, I wonder?" She turned to look at him, her face half in shadow. "Sometimes I think if he'd just talked about it, maybe the ghosts wouldn't have haunted him so badly." Wyatt stood abruptly. "Some ghosts don't leave no matter what you do, Miss Zimmerman." "Violet," she corrected gently, "and perhaps you're right. But I've found that ghosts seem less frightening when you're not facing them alone." He looked down at her, this woman who spoke of things she couldn't possibly understand, yet somehow seemed to see into the darkest corners of his soul. "Good night, Violet," he said, placing his hat on his head. "Good night, Wyatt," she replied. "I hope you find some peace before morning." He left her there in the church, feeling oddly shaken. No one had spoken to him so directly about the war since he'd left the army. Most folks saw the haunted look in a veteran's eyes and knew to keep their distance. But not Violet Zimmerman. She stepped right up to the edge of his darkness without flinching. Over the next few weeks, Wyatt found himself crossing paths with Violet more frequently than could be explained by chance alone. She seemed to materialize wherever he went, at the general store, by the creek where he sometimes fished, on the trail to town. Each time she greeted him with that same gentle smile, engaged him in brief conversation, then continued on her way, never pushing when he grew taciturn. Henry noticed. "My niece seems mighty interested in you, Griffith," he commented one day as they mended a section of fence. "Just being neighborly, I expect," Wyatt replied, hammering a post with more force than necessary. "Maybe," Henry said, eyeing him thoughtfully. "Or maybe she sees something in you worth knowing better." "Not much to know," Wyatt muttered. Henry laughed. "Son, I've been around long enough to spot a man carrying heavy burdens. Whatever you're running from, it followed you here. Might be time to turn and face it." Wyatt said nothing, focusing on the fence, but Henry's words lingered in his mind throughout the day. That evening, as Wyatt sat on the porch of the bunkhouse cleaning his saddle, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main house. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass pierced the twilight calm. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver as he ran toward the disturbance. He found 3 men on the main house porch. 2 held Henry, who was struggling against their grip. The third had Violet by the arm, her face a mask of fear and anger. "Let her go," Wyatt said, his voice deadly calm as he drew his pistol. The men turned, and Wyatt recognized them as drifters who'd been hanging around town the past few days. The largest one, clearly the leader, sneered. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. We just come to collect a debt this old man's brother owed us." "James never owed you vultures a penny," Henry spat. "You're nothing but claim jumpers who tried to swindle him." "Well, he ain't here to argue the point," the leader said with a cruel laugh. "But his pretty daughter might be worth what he owed one way or another." Violet struggled against his grip. "My father would rather die than do business with men like you." "Well, he did die, didn't he?" The man yanked her closer. "And left you unprotected." "She's not unprotected," Wyatt said, cocking his revolver. "Step away from her now." Something in Wyatt's eyes, perhaps the cold, empty look of a man who had killed before and could do so again without remorse, made the leader hesitate. 3 against 1, Cowboy," he said, but his bravado sounded hollow. "I like those odds," Wyatt replied. "First shot goes through your head. How do your friends feel about those odds?" The 2 men holding Henry exchanged nervous glances. "This ain't worth dying over, Jack," one muttered. The leader's face twisted with rage, but he released Violet, shoving her toward Wyatt. "This ain't over," he snarled. Nobody threatens Jack Reeves and lives to brag about it. Yet here I stand, Wyatt said evenly. Now get off this property before I decide my trigger finger needs exercise. The men backed away, releasing Henry. They mounted horses tied nearby and rode off, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Henry rushed to Violet, who was trembling but unharmed. "Are you all right, girl?" she nodded, then looked at Wyatt with wide eyes. "Thank you." Wyatt holstered his gun, the familiar calm that always came over him in danger now receding, leaving him shaky with delayed reaction. "Who were they?" Henry's face darkened. "Scoundrels who tried to cheat my brother out of his business in St. Louis. When he refused to sell to them, they threatened him. I never thought they'd follow Violet here." "They won't bother you again," Wyatt said with certainty. "How can you be sure?" Violet asked. "Because men like that are cowards at heart. They prey on those they perceive as weak." His eyes met hers. "They won't make that mistake again." That night, Wyatt positioned himself on the porch of the main house, rifle across his knees. He didn't expect the men to return so soon, but he wasn't taking chances. Around midnight, the door opened, and Violet emerged with a cup of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing it to him. "Thank you." He took a sip, appreciating the warmth. "You should be resting." "I tried." She settled on the step below him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that man's face." Wyatt nodded, understanding all too well. "First light, I'll ride into town, have a word with the sheriff. Make sure he knows those men are trouble. You were so calm," she said, looking up at him, "when you confronted them. Not a hint of fear." "Fear gets a man killed," he said. "You learn to push it down, act anyway." In the war, he was quiet for a long moment. "Among other places. You saved us today," she said softly. "Thank you." "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she shook her head. "Not anyone. Most men would have stayed clear, not risked their lives for a boss and his niece." Wyatt sipped his coffee, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest, Violet. Morning comes early." She stood, but instead of going inside, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Wyatt Griffith, whether you believe it or not." Before he could respond, she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Wyatt remained on the porch, rifle ready, her words echoing in his mind until dawn streaked the eastern sky. True to his word, Wyatt rode into town at first light to speak with Sheriff Taylor. The lawman, a grizzled veteran himself, promised to keep an eye out for the troublemakers and run them out of the county if they showed their faces again. "Recognize the description," Taylor said, leaning back in his chair. "Reeves' gang. Small-time criminals but mean as rattlesnakes. They've been working their way west, staying just ahead of the law." "They threatened Miss Zimmerman directly," Wyatt said, his jaw tight. "I don't plan to wait for them to try again." Taylor studied him with knowing eyes. "What regiment were you with, son?" Wyatt stiffened. "How did you know?" "Takes one to know one." Taylor tapped his chest, where a Confederate bullet still rested near his heart. 12th Tennessee myself." 6th Ohio, Wyatt admitted after a moment. Taylor nodded. "Thought so. Got that look about you. Still fighting the war in your head, ain't you?" Wyatt didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Listen," Taylor leaned forward. "I'll do my job, keep an eye out for these drifters. But you watch yourself. Men like us, we sometimes go looking for fights to give those ghosts in our heads something else to focus on. That's a quick way to an early grave." "I'm just protecting my employer and his niece," Wyatt said. "Sure," Taylor nodded. "Just make sure that's all you're doing." Wyatt left the sheriff's office with an uneasy feeling. Was Taylor right? Was he looking for a fight? The confrontation with Reeves had been the first time in months that Wyatt had felt truly alive, the familiar rush of danger drowning out the constant murmur of painful memories. As he rode back to the ranch, Wyatt found himself thinking about Violet. Her quiet strength, her directness, her compassion. She didn't shy away from difficult truths or painful realities. There was something refreshing about that, something that drew him to her despite his determination to keep his distance. When he arrived back at the ranch, he found her in the garden behind the main house, tending to rows of vegetables. She looked up as his shadow fell across the earth, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Sheriff says he'll keep an eye out for those men," Wyatt reported, "but it might be best if you don't go into town alone for a while." "Is that your professional assessment, Mr. Griffith?" she asked, a teasing light in her eyes. "Just common sense," he replied, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Well, as it happens, I need to go into town this afternoon for supplies. Perhaps you would be kind enough to escort me." Wyatt hesitated, then nodded. "I'll finish my chores and be ready by 2. The ride into Muskogee that afternoon was pleasant, the late spring air fragrant with wildflowers. Violet rode side saddle on a gentle mare, chatting about her plans for expanding the garden and perhaps starting a small orchard. "Uncle Henry says the soil here is good for apple trees," she said. "I've always loved apple blossoms in the spring." "My mother had apple trees," Wyatt found himself saying. "Back in Ohio, I used to climb them as a boy." Violet smiled, clearly pleased that he'd shared even this small piece of his past. "Do you miss it, Ohio?" He considered the question. "Sometimes, but it changed after the war." "Or maybe I changed." "Both, probably," she said thoughtfully. "War changes everything it touches." In town, they drew curious glances as they made their way down the main street. Wyatt Griffith, the solitary cowboy, escorting the lovely newcomer, it was enough to set tongues wagging in a small place like Muskogee. At the general store, Violet carefully selected seeds, fabric, and other necessities while Wyatt stood near the door, vigilant. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, bustled about, clearly delighted to have Violet's business. "Such a lovely young woman," she said to Wyatt while Violet examined bolts of cloth. "And so brave, coming all this way after losing her father. She'll make some lucky man a fine wife." Wyatt grunted noncommittally, uncomfortable with the matchmaking gleam in the older woman's eye. As they left the store, packages loaded onto their horses, the sound of raised voices drew their attention to the saloon across the street. A crowd had gathered outside, and in the center stood Jack Reeves and his companions, facing off against Sheriff Taylor. "Trouble," Wyatt murmured, instinctively moving to position himself between Violet and the potential danger. "I told you boys to move on," Taylor was saying, hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Muskogee doesn't need your kind of trouble." "Free country last I checked," Reeves sneered. "We got as much right to be here as anyone." "Not when you're threatening citizens under my protection," Taylor replied evenly. Reeves' eyes suddenly locked onto Wyatt and Violet across the street. A slow, malevolent smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is," he called. "The hero cowboy and the pretty little orphan." Wyatt's hand moved to his gun. "Get on your horse," he murmured to Violet. "Ride back to the ranch, now." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered back. "This isn't a discussion," he said, his eyes never leaving Reeves. "No, it's not," she agreed, standing her ground. Before the situation could escalate further, Taylor stepped between Reeves and his line of sight to Wyatt and Violet. "You boys have a choice," the sheriff said loudly. "Ride out of town now, peaceful-like, or spend the night in my jail before I escort you to the county line tomorrow." "What's it going to be?" For a tense moment, it seemed Reeves might choose confrontation. But after eyeing the growing crowd of townsfolk, many of whom looked none too friendly, he spat on the ground. "Come on, boys," he said. This two-bit town ain't worth our time." As they mounted their horses, Reeves called out, "See you around, cowboy. You and the lady both." They rode off in a cloud of dust, hooting and hollering as they went. The crowd dispersed, muttering about the troublemakers while Taylor crossed the street to where Wyatt and Violet stood. "They're headed south," the sheriff said. "I'll send word to the marshal in Tahlequah to watch for them." He gave Wyatt a significant look. "Might be best if you two head back to the ranch and keep your eyes open on the trail." Wyatt nodded, helping Violet mount her horse. They rode out of town at a brisk pace, Wyatt constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of ambush. "You think they'll really leave?" Violet asked as they crossed a shallow stream. "No," Wyatt said honestly. "Men like that, when they're challenged, they take it personally. They'll be back." "Because of me," she said, a note of guilt in her voice. "This isn't your fault," Wyatt said firmly. "They're the ones in the wrong, not you." They reached the ranch without incident, but Wyatt's unease persisted. After helping Violet unload her packages, he sought out Henry to discuss increasing security around the property. "I'll have the hands take turns standing watch at night," Henry agreed after hearing Wyatt's concerns. "And I'll dig out my old shotgun. Been a while since I needed it, but I reckon it still works." That night, Wyatt took the first watch, positioning himself where he could see both the approach to the ranch and the main house. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape and making it easier to spot any movement. Around midnight, soft footsteps approached. Wyatt turned, gun drawn, only to find Violet carrying a tray with coffee and cornbread. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on a nearby stump. "You should be inside," he said, though he accepted the coffee gratefully. "I couldn't sleep." She sat beside him, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Knowing you're out here standing guard because of me." "It's my job." "Is it? I thought your job was herding cattle and mending fences." He sipped his coffee, conceding the point with a slight nod. "Consider it a favor to your uncle, then." "And is that all it is?" she asked softly. "A favor to my uncle." Wyatt looked at her then, really looked at her. In the moonlight, her features were softened, ethereal. Her eyes held a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "What are you asking, Violet?" "I'm asking why a man who goes to such lengths to avoid attachment, to keep everyone at arm's length, would risk his life for people he barely knows." "It's the right thing to do," he said simply. "Yes," she agreed. "But there are plenty of people in this world who don't do the right thing, even when it's staring them in the face. You're different, Wyatt. You carry so much pain, and yet you still choose to protect others. That says something about who you are." "You don't know me," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "I know more than you think," she replied. "I recognize the look in your eyes. I saw it in my father every day until he died, the weight of memories too heavy to bear alone. Some burdens can't be shared, Violet." "All burdens can be shared," she countered. "It's just a question of finding someone strong enough to help carry them." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. For the first time in years, Wyatt felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain or regret or anger. Something warm and dangerously like hope. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of a gunshot. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, pulling Violet behind the shelter of a large oak tree. "Get to the house," he ordered. "Wake your uncle. Tell him to arm the ranch hands. What about you? I'm going to find out what that was." "Wyatt, no, go, Violet. Now." She hesitated, then squeezed his arm once before running toward the house, keeping low as he'd instructed. Wyatt watched until she was safely inside, then moved cautiously toward the source of the gunshot. He found one of the ranch hands, young Billy Osborne, lying on the ground near the south pasture fence. The boy was alive but bleeding from a bullet wound to his shoulder. "Reeves," Billy gasped when Wyatt knelt beside him. "Him and his men, they're stealing cattle." Wyatt quickly bound the wound with a strip torn from his own shirt. "How many?" "3 that I saw. They shot me when I tried to stop them." Distant hoofbeats and the lowing of frightened cattle confirmed Billy's story. Wyatt helped the young man to his feet. "Can you make it to the house?" Billy nodded grimly. "Go get those bastards." Wyatt returned to his post long enough to collect his rifle, then moved stealthily toward the south pasture. In the moonlight, he could make out several riders herding a small group of cattle toward the property line. Henry and the other ranch hands arrived, armed and grim-faced. "Billy told us what happened," Henry said. "Those are my best breeding stock they're taking." "We'll get them back," Wyatt promised. "But we need to be smart about this. Reeves is dangerous." They quickly formulated a plan. While the other hands circled around to cut off the rustlers' escape route, Wyatt and Henry would approach from the front, using the element of surprise. As they moved into position, Wyatt felt the familiar cold focus descend over him, the same state of mind that had kept him alive through dozens of battles. Time seemed to slow as they approached the rustlers, who were focused on moving the cattle through a gap in the fence. "That's far enough, Reeves," Wyatt called, his rifle aimed steady. "Let the cattle go and you might ride out of here alive." Reeves and his men spun, guns drawn. "Shoulda minded your own business, cowboy," Reeves snarled, firing wildly. The night erupted in gunfire. Wyatt dove for cover behind a large rock, returning fire with practiced precision. Henry crouched nearby, his old shotgun booming in the darkness. From the other direction, the ranch hands closed in, effectively surrounding the rustlers. One of Reeves' men fell with a cry, clutching his leg. The other, seeing the odds turn against them, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. But Reeves, enraged and cornered, kept firing, bullets whining off rocks and splintering fence posts. "It's over, Reeves," Wyatt shouted. "Throw down your gun, go to hell." Reeves screamed, spinning toward the sound of Wyatt's voice and firing repeatedly. Wyatt felt a bullet graze his arm, but his return shot found its mark. Reeves staggered, clutching his chest, then fell face forward into the dirt. The sudden silence was deafening. Cautiously, Wyatt approached the fallen man, kicking his gun away before checking for a pulse. There was none. He looked up at Henry, who had moved to stand beside him. "It was a clean shot," Henry said quietly. "Self-defense, plain and simple." Wyatt nodded, but the familiar hollow feeling was already settling in his stomach. Another death on his conscience, another face to join the parade of ghosts that haunted his dreams. They rounded up the stolen cattle and secured the surviving rustlers to be delivered to Sheriff Taylor in the morning. The wounded man was treated and placed under guard in the barn. Through it all, Wyatt moved methodically, giving instructions and tending to necessary tasks, but his mind felt distant from his body, as if watching himself from afar. As dawn broke, he found himself alone at the creek that ran through the Wilkinson property, washing Reeves' blood from his hands. The cold water numbed his fingers but did nothing to ease the heaviness in his chest. Soft footsteps approached, and he knew without looking that it was Violet. She sat beside him on the creek bank, saying nothing for a long while. "Uncle Henry told me what happened," she finally said. "You saved the ranch, saved our livelihood." "I killed a man," Wyatt replied, his voice hollow. "A man who would have killed you without hesitation. A man who shot an innocent boy and tried to destroy our ranch. Does that make it easier, justifying it?" She considered his question seriously. "No, I don't suppose it does. Taking a life is never easy, nor should it be. But carrying guilt for defending yourself and others, that's a burden you don't deserve." Wyatt stared at his reflection in the rippling water. "During the war, I killed so many men I lost count, some not much more than boys. At first, I told myself it was for the Union, for freedom. But after a while, the reasons didn't matter. It just became what I did." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "What kind of man does that make me?" "It makes you a soldier who survived," she said gently. "Who did what was necessary in impossible circumstances." She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. "But the war is over, Wyatt. You don't have to be that man anymore." "I don't know how to be anyone else," he admitted, the words torn from some deep, wounded place inside him. "Then let me help you remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let me be your peace." Something broke inside Wyatt then, a dam that had held back years of grief and pain and loneliness. He didn't realize he was crying until Violet gathered him in her arms, holding him as sobs racked his body. She said nothing, asked nothing, simply held him as the first light of dawn transformed the world around them. When the storm had passed, Wyatt felt emptied out, scoured clean. Violet's hand remained in his, a lifeline in the aftermath of emotional upheaval. "I'm sorry," he began, but she shook her head. "Never apologize for feeling, Wyatt. Never apologize for being human." He looked at her then, really looked at her, this remarkable woman who had somehow slipped past all his defenses and found the wounded man hiding behind the stoic cowboy facade. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why do you care?" Her smile was gentle, tinged with sadness. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of my father, a good man carrying wounds too deep to heal on his own. I couldn't help my father find peace before he died. But perhaps I can help you." "I don't deserve peace," Wyatt said, voicing the belief that had driven him for years. "Everyone deserves peace, Wyatt, especially those who have seen the worst of humanity and still choose to protect others." The days following the shootout brought significant changes to the Wilkinson Ranch. Sheriff Taylor ruled Reeves' death justifiable self-defense, and the surviving rustlers were sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. Billy Osborne recovered from his wound, proudly showing off his scar to anyone who would look. And Wyatt, to his own surprise, found himself spending more time at the main house, often sharing evening meals with Henry and Violet. Gradually, haltingly, he began to speak of his past, of his childhood in Ohio, of the idealistic young man who had enlisted in the Union Army believing he was fighting for a just cause, of the disillusionment and horror that followed as the war dragged on, taking friends and comrades and pieces of his soul with each bloody battle. Violet listened without judgment, offering comfort when he needed it and space when he didn't. In turn, she shared stories of her own life, of growing up with a father traumatized by war, of losing her mother to consumption when she was 12, of managing her father's affairs as his health declined. "He tried to be a good father," she told Wyatt one evening as they sat on the porch swing. "But part of him never came home from the war. He was always looking over his shoulder, jumping at loud noises, waking up screaming." "And you took care of him," Wyatt said, recognizing in her story the strength that had first drawn him to her. She nodded. "Someone had to, and I loved him, broken as he was." Wyatt's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. Such gestures had become increasingly common between them, small points of connection that anchored him when memories threatened to pull him under. Summer progressed, the days growing hotter as Muskogee baked under the relentless Oklahoma sun. The ranch flourished under Henry's management and Violet's innovative ideas. She had indeed started an orchard, planting apple seedlings with Wyatt's help, and had begun selling preserves and baked goods in town, adding a new revenue stream to the ranch's operations. Wyatt watched her bloom in this new life, her natural resilience and creativity finding fertile ground in the frontier setting. And with each passing day, he felt something within himself transforming as well, the hard shell of isolation cracking to reveal tender new growth beneath. The nightmares didn't disappear. Wyatt doubted they ever would completely, but they came less frequently now. And when they did come, leaving him gasping and disoriented in the darkness, he no longer faced them alone. More than once, unable to return to sleep, he had walked to the main house to find Violet waiting on the porch, as if she somehow knew he needed her. On one such night in late July, they sat together watching meteors streak across the vast Oklahoma sky. "My mother used to say shooting stars were the souls of the departed racing across the heavens," Violet said, her head resting against Wyatt's shoulder. "What do you think?" he asked. She considered the question. "I think they're reminders that even in darkness, there can be moments of breathtaking beauty." Wyatt looked down at her, this woman who had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Violet," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not the man you deserve. I'm broken in ways that might never fully heal." She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I expect perfection?" She took his hands in hers. "I've seen broken men all my life, Wyatt. My father, neighbors, friends who came back from the war shadows of themselves. But there's a difference between being broken and being defeated." "And which am I?" he asked. "Neither," she said with conviction. "You're healing. It's a slow process, often painful, but it's happening. I've seen it day by day." He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of reverence and gratitude. "Because of you." "No," she shook her head. "You were ready to heal. I just happened to be here when you were ready to try." Wyatt knew she was being modest. Without Violet, he would still be drifting, haunted and alone, moving from place to place whenever the memories became too intense. She had given him a reason to stay, to face his demons rather than flee from them. "I love you," he said, the words emerging naturally, as inevitable as sunrise. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I know it's true." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears in the starlight. "I love you too, Wyatt Griffith, with all that you are, all that you've been, and all that you're becoming." Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. When they finally parted, breathless and a little dazed, Wyatt felt as if some fundamental shift had occurred in the universe, or perhaps just in his heart. "Marry me," he said impulsively. Her eyes widened. "Wyatt, I know it's sudden," he rushed on, "and I have nothing to offer but myself, damaged as I am, but I love you, Violet, and if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be the man you deserve." Her smile could have illuminated the darkest night. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Griffith." They were married in September, as the first hints of autumn cooled the Oklahoma air. The ceremony was small, held in the Muskogee church where they had first truly connected. Henry gave his niece away with tears in his eyes and joy in his heart. Sheriff Taylor stood as Wyatt's best man, a friendship that had developed in the months since the showdown with Reeves. Violet wore a simple white dress, adorned with lace she had sewn herself, and wildflowers in her hair. Wyatt, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, stood tall and straight, his eyes never leaving her as she walked toward him on her uncle's arm. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Wyatt felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long and arduous journey. The celebration afterward at the Wilkinson Ranch lasted well into the night, with neighbors and townsfolk joining in the festivities. Wyatt, who had once avoided such gatherings like the plague, found himself at ease among the well-wishers, Violet's hand in his a constant reminder that he was no longer alone in the world. Henry had given them a wedding gift beyond price, a parcel of land adjacent to the main ranch, with a small but sturdy cabin and enough acreage to start their own operation, while still working closely with the larger Wilkinson spread. It was always meant for family, Henry explained when he presented them with the deed. And now, that's what you are. They moved into the cabin the day after the wedding, making it their own with simple furnishings and personal touches. Violet hung curtains she had sewn and placed wildflowers in jars on every available surface. Wyatt built shelves and a rocking chair for the porch, working with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. Their life together fell into a pleasant rhythm. Days were filled with work, Wyatt dividing his time between their small spread and Henry's ranch, Violet tending to their home and garden and continuing her successful preserves business. Evenings were for conversation, for reading aloud to each other, for simply being together in comfortable silence. And nights were for discovering each other, for healing touches and whispered endearments, for the kind of intimacy Wyatt had never imagined possible. In Violet's arms, he found a sanctuary from the memories that had haunted him for so long. The nightmares still came occasionally, but now when he woke gasping and disoriented, Violet was there, her calm voice and gentle hands bringing him back to the present, reminding him that he was safe, that he was loved. "Tell me," she would say. "Tell me what you saw." And gradually, haltingly, he did. He told her of Antietam and Gettysburg, of Chickamauga and Cold Harbor. He spoke of friends lost and horrors witnessed, of choices made in the heat of battle that he questioned in the cold light of peacetime. With each telling, the memories seemed to lose a fraction of their power over him. "It's like lancing a wound," Violet observed one night as they lay together, her head on his chest. "Painful but necessary for healing." Wyatt stroked her hair, marveling at her wisdom. "How did you get to be so smart?" She smiled against his skin. "I've had good teachers, pain, loss, love." She raised her head to look at him. "Especially love." As autumn deepened into winter, Muskogee was transformed by snow, unusual for Oklahoma but welcomed by farmers for the moisture it would bring to the soil. Wyatt and Violet's cabin was a haven of warmth, with a crackling fire in the hearth and the scent of violets baking filling the air. On Christmas Eve, they joined Henry for dinner at the main house, exchanging simple gifts and sharing stories late into the night. As they prepared to leave, bundled against the cold for the short ride home, Violet pulled her uncle into a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Henry, never one for sentimentality, blinked rapidly. "You two are the best gift an old man could ask for," he said gruffly. "Made this place feel like a real home again." Back in their cabin, as midnight approached, Violet handed Wyatt one final gift, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "What's this?" he asked, surprised. "We already exchanged gifts." "This one couldn't wait until morning," she said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. Puzzled, Wyatt unwrapped the package to find a tiny pair of hand-knitted booties. He stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment before understanding dawned. His eyes flew to Violet's face, finding confirmation in her radiant expression. We're going to have a baby," she finished for him, laughing at his stunned expression. "In June, the doctor says." Wyatt gathered her in his arms, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion, joy, fear, awe, gratitude, all mingled together in a potent brew that left him speechless. A child. His child. "Their child, are you happy?" Violet asked, searching his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he managed, his voice thick. "I never thought I'd have this, Violet. A wife, a home, a child on the way. After the war, I didn't think I deserved any of it." "Oh, my love," she said, cupping his face in her hands. You deserve every happiness this world has to offer." As they stood together by the firelight, snow falling softly outside their window, Wyatt marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the blood-soaked fields of war to this peaceful cabin in Indian Territory. From a solitary existence haunted by ghosts to a life rich with love and promise. The past would always be part of him, the memories, the scars both visible and hidden, but it no longer defined him or controlled his future. With Violet by his side, he had found his way back to the land of the living, back to hope, back to peace. The winter passed in a blur of preparations. Wyatt expanded the cabin, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. He crafted a cradle from oak, carving delicate leaves and flowers into the headboard. Violet sewed tiny garments and quilts, her body changing as their child grew within her. Henry was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a great uncle, already planning fishing trips and horseback rides years in advance. The ranch hands teased Wyatt good-naturedly about his impending fatherhood, but he took it in stride, a new confidence evident in his bearing. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. Violet's apple seedlings put forth their first tentative blossoms, a promise of harvests to come in future years. As her pregnancy advanced, Violet moved more slowly but remained active, refusing to be confined indoors despite Wyatt's protective concerns. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him when he fussed. "Most of them while working in fields or tending house. I'm perfectly capable of walking to the garden." Her independence both frustrated and impressed him. In a time when many men viewed their wives as delicate creatures to be sheltered and protected, Violet's strength and self-reliance were remarkable. Yet Wyatt couldn't help worrying, knowing all too well how quickly life's blessings could be snatched away. One evening in late May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Violet took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly. "Feel," she said. "He's active tonight." Under his palm, Wyatt felt the unmistakable movement of their child, a kick, a roll, a sign of the vibrant life they had created together. Wyatt asked, raising an eyebrow. "You sound certain." Violet smiled. "Just a feeling. But whether boy or girl, this child will be loved beyond measure." "Yes," Wyatt agreed, his throat tight with emotion. Beyond measure. He thought of his own father, a stern man who had rarely shown affection or approval. Wyatt had joined the army partly to escape his father's cold judgment, to prove himself a man worthy of respect. How different his child's life would be surrounded by love, accepted unconditionally, never doubting their place in the world or their worth. "What kind of father will I be?" he wondered aloud, voicing the fear that had grown alongside his joy in recent months. Violet's hand covered his where it rested on her belly. "The kind who loves deeply, protects fiercely, and teaches by example what it means to be honorable and brave. And if the nightmares never fully leave, if there are days when the past pulls me under, then we face those days together, as a family," she said simply. "Our child will know that strength isn't about never faltering, it's about getting back up when you do." June arrived with scorching heat that left the grass brown and the creek reduced to a trickle. Wyatt worked from dawn to dusk, ensuring their livestock had adequate water and that the garden Violet had planted survived the drought. On the evening of June 15th, as they sat down to supper, Violet suddenly gripped the edge of the table, her face paling. "Violet?" Wyatt was instantly alert. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, then met his eyes with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I think it's time." The next hours were a blur of activity. Wyatt rode to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Collins, who lived in town, while Henry came to stay with Violet. By the time Wyatt returned with the midwife, Violet's labor was well established. Mrs. Collins, a no-nonsense woman who had delivered half the babies in Muskogee County, shooed the men outside, allowing only periodic brief visits from Wyatt to hold Violet's hand and offer encouragement. As night fell, Wyatt paced the porch, every cry from inside the cabin sending a spike of fear through his heart. Henry sat in the rocking chair, smoking his pipe, his own concern evident despite his outward calm. "She's strong, Wyatt," he said. "Strong as they come." "I know," Wyatt replied, running a hand through his hair. "But so was my mother, and she died bringing me into this world." Henry nodded soberly. "That happens sometimes, but Mrs. Collins is the best midwife in the territory. She'll see Violet through." The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. The moon set, leaving the world in darkness before the first hint of dawn. And still, Wyatt paced, prayed, and waited, feeling more helpless than he had in the worst battles of the war. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten, a new sound pierced the night, the lusty cry of a newborn. Wyatt froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin door opened, and Mrs. Collins emerged, her face wreathed in smiles despite her exhaustion. "Congratulations, Mr. Griffith," she said. "You have a daughter, and your wife is asking for you." Wyatt entered the cabin on unsteady legs. Violet lay in their bed, pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, and the love in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Wyatt sat gently on the edge of the bed, afraid to disturb the peaceful tableau before him. Violet folded back the blanket to reveal a tiny face, red and wrinkled with a tuft of dark hair. "She's perfect," Wyatt whispered, his finger gently touching his daughter's cheek. "Just like her mother." "Would you like to hold her?" Violet asked. Fear gripped him, fear of his own strength, of his rough hands that had taken life now cradling something so fragile and new. But Violet didn't wait for his answer, carefully transferring the tiny bundle into his arms. The weight of his daughter, so light yet so profound, anchored Wyatt to the earth in a way nothing else ever had. She squirmed slightly, her eyes opening to reveal deep blue orbs that seemed to look straight into his soul. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your father." The simple words unlocked something within him, a wellspring of love so pure and overwhelming that tears streamed unchecked down his face. This was what he had fought for in the war, though he hadn't known it then, not abstract concepts like union or freedom, but this, the chance for life to continue, for love to flourish, for families to grow in peace. "What shall we name her?" Violet asked. Wyatt looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who had given him not just a child but a future he could believe in. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." Violet's smile was radiant. "Hope Elizabeth Griffith," she agreed. "Perfect." As the sun rose on their first day as a family of 3, Wyatt felt a peace he had never known before. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long seemed to retreat in the face of this new life, this testament to the possibility of renewal and redemption. The months that followed were a tapestry of joy and exhaustion, of midnight feedings and first smiles, of discoveries large and small. Hope thrived under her parents' devoted care, growing from a fragile newborn to a chubby, laughing infant with remarkable speed. Wyatt threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he had once brought to soldiering, but with infinitely more joy. He carried Hope with him as he did chores around their small ranch, narrating his activities to her attentive gaze. He rocked her to sleep when she was fussy, sang her the lullabies he remembered his mother singing to his younger siblings, built her toys with his own hands. "You're a natural," Violet observed one evening as Wyatt bathed their daughter in a small tin tub, carefully supporting her head while she kicked and splashed. "She makes it easy," Wyatt replied, though they both knew it wasn't always so. Hope had a healthy set of lungs and wasn't shy about using them when displeased. As autumn returned to Oklahoma, painting the landscape in gold and crimson, the Griffiths celebrated their first wedding anniversary and Hope's 4-month milestone. Henry joined them for a special dinner, bringing a hand-carved wooden horse for his great niece. "For when she's older," he explained. "Every child needs a good horse, even a toy one." After dinner, as Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, the adults sat by the fire, sharing memories and dreams for the future. "I've been thinking," Henry said, swirling whiskey in his glass. "I'm not getting any younger, and this ranch is too much for one old man to manage alone." Wyatt and Violet exchanged glances, sensing where this conversation was heading. "I was hoping," Henry continued, "that you might consider moving back to the main house, Wyatt taking over as foreman with an eye to eventually running the whole operation." The offer was generous beyond measure. The Wilkinson Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the county, and Henry had no children of his own to inherit it. "We're honored, Uncle Henry," Violet said, clearly moved. "But this is your legacy." "And what good is a legacy without someone to carry it forward?" Henry asked. "You're my family, the only family I care about. I want to see this place flourish in your hands, watch Hope grow up here, maybe more children after her." He looked at Wyatt. "What do you say, son?" Wyatt felt a surge of emotion at being called son by this man he had come to respect so deeply. "I say we'd be fools to refuse such a generous offer, but on one condition." "Name it," Henry said. "That you teach me everything you know about ranching." "I've learned a lot these past months, but there's still plenty I don't understand." Henry grinned, raising his glass in a toast. "Deal. We'll start with the books tomorrow." And so the Griffiths' future took another unexpected turn, one that promised stability and prosperity for generations to come. They moved into the main house the following week, transforming the spacious old building with the laughter of a child and the energy of a young family. Wyatt took to his new responsibilities with determination and intelligence, absorbing Henry's lifetime of ranching knowledge like a sponge. Violet expanded her preserves business, hiring 2 local women to help with production, as demand grew beyond Muskogee to neighboring communities. Hope continued to grow and thrive, taking her first steps on Christmas Day, much to the delight of her adoring family. And as winter gave way to spring once more, Violet shared the news that another child would join their family in the fall. "Are you happy?" she asked Wyatt, echoing the question she had asked when telling him about Hope. "Beyond words," he replied honestly. "Sometimes I wake up afraid this is all a dream, that I'll open my eyes and be back in that tent at Antietam, with all this joy still unknown and unimaginable." "Not a dream," Violet assured him, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Very real and very much ours." Their second child, a son they named William Henry Griffith, was born as the first snow of winter dusted the Oklahoma plains. Hope, nearly 18 months old, regarded her baby brother with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, but soon appointed herself his devoted guardian. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and milestones. The ranch prospered under Wyatt's management, expanding its operations to include not just cattle but also horses, as Wyatt discovered a talent for breeding and training quality stock. Violet's preserves business became a regional success, her jams and jellies shipped as far as Kansas City and St. Louis. The nightmares that had once defined Wyatt's existence became increasingly rare. When they did come, they no longer held the power to devastate him. Violet remained his anchor, But he had also found strength within himself, the strength not just to survive his past, but to build a future despite it. In the spring of 1875, as Hope prepared to start school and little William toddled after his sister on sturdy legs, Wyatt received a letter that brought the past rushing back. It was from a former comrade in the 6th Ohio, inviting him to a reunion of the regiment in Cincinnati that summer. "Are you going to go?" Violet asked when he showed her the letter. Wyatt hesitated. "I don't know. I've spent so long trying to forget." "Perhaps it's time to remember," she suggested gently. "Not the horror, but the brotherhood. The men who stood beside you, who understand what you've carried all these years." After much consideration, Wyatt decided to attend. He and Violet made the long journey east by train, leaving the children in Henry's capable care. Cincinnati was both familiar and foreign to Wyatt, the city of his youth now transformed by progress and prosperity. The reunion was held in a hotel ballroom with over 100 veterans in attendance. Wyatt entered with trepidation, Violet's hand clasped firmly in his. For a moment, he felt like the haunted drifter who had ridden into Muskogee 5 years earlier, out of place and ill at ease. Then a voice called his name. "Griffith! Wyatt Griffith, as I live and breathe," a man approached, older and heavier than Wyatt remembered, but with the same infectious grin. "Tommy Reynolds," Wyatt said, recognition dawning. "You made it through." "That I did, though it was a close thing at Cold Harbor." Tommy pumped Wyatt's hand enthusiastically. "Never thought I'd see you again. You disappeared after Appomattox." "I needed some distance," Wyatt admitted. Tommy nodded understandingly, then noticed Violet. "And who is this lovely lady?" "My wife, Violet," Wyatt said, a note of pride in his voice. "Violet, this is Tommy Reynolds. We served together from 62 to 65. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Griffith," Tommy said, bowing slightly. "Your husband was the best shot in the regiment and the steadiest man in a fight." "The pleasure is mine," Violet replied warmly. "Any friend of Wyatt's is a friend of ours." Throughout the evening, Wyatt reconnected with men he had known during the darkest period of his life. Some, like him, had found peace and purpose in the years since the war. Others still struggled, carrying visible and invisible wounds that had never properly healed. During a quiet moment, Wyatt found himself standing with a small group of veterans, all men he had once known well. The conversation turned, as it inevitably would, to their shared experiences in battle. "You still see them?" one man asked quietly. "The faces of the men you killed?" There was a murmur of assent around the circle. Each man there knew the ghosts of which he spoke. "I used to," Wyatt said after a moment. "Every night in my dreams, sometimes during the day too. For years after the war, I couldn't escape them." "And now?" another asked. Wyatt thought about it. "They're still there, but fainter, like photographs that have faded in the sun." He glanced across the room to where Violet was engaged in conversation with a group of wives. "I found someone who helped me understand that I could acknowledge the past without being consumed by it. Someone who showed me that peace was possible, even for men like us." The men nodded, some with understanding, others with envy or hope. "You're lucky, Griffith," Tommy said. "Not all of us found that kind of peace." "I know," Wyatt replied soberly, "and I don't take it for granted, not for a single day." As they prepared to leave Cincinnati and return to Oklahoma, Wyatt took Violet to a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city. There, among rows of simple markers, he knelt before a gravestone bearing the name Margaret Griffith, beloved wife and mother. "My mother," he explained to Violet. "I told you she died when I was born. My father brought me here once when I was about 10. It's the only time I ever saw him cry." Violet placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. "She would be proud of the man you've become, Wyatt, the husband and father you are." "I hope so," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For so long I thought my life was defined by death, my mother's, the men I killed in the war. But that's not true, is it? Life is stronger than death in the end." "Yes," Violet agreed, her hand finding his. "Life and love both." They returned to Muskogee, changed by the experience, Wyatt with a sense of closure, Violet with a deeper understanding of the man she had married. The ranch welcomed them home, Hope and William running to meet them with excited cries and Henry watching from the porch with a contented smile. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into silence, Wyatt and Violet sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. "Thank you," Wyatt said simply. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. For being brave enough to love a broken man. For our children, our home, our life." He turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his existence. "For being my peace when I thought peace was something I would never know again." Violet leaned into his embrace, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin as it always had. "You saved yourself, Wyatt. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." "Either way," he murmured into her hair, "I'm the luckiest man alive." As they sat together in the gentle Oklahoma night, surrounded by the life they had built from the ashes of war and loss, Wyatt Griffith, once a cowboy haunted by the ghosts of battle, now a rancher, husband and father blessed beyond measure, knew with absolute certainty that some wounds, no matter how deep, could heal. And some hearts, no matter how scarred, could learn to love again. The end.